Back in 2003, Canada decided not to join the American-led invasion of Iraq. Bill Graham was Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, and he joins us now for 10 questions on why the Canadian government stayed out of the Iraq mission. Mr. Graham, welcome. Nice to have you here again.
Thanks, Steve.
You talk about this, incidentally, in your book, The Call of the World. Here's question one. In 2002, when the U.S. government first floated the idea of invading Iraq, what was the behind-the-scenes situation like, and the conversations like in Canadian government circles about that notion?
If you think back, Steve, conversations about a possibility of Iraq started floating pretty close after 9/11 because the Bush administration was making noises, or some members of the Bush administration were making noises about Iraqi involvement in that, where certainly nobody else could see where this came from. But so it was early on. I became foreign minister in February of 2002. I sort of came in when things were already moving along in that respect. It didn't really come up, in my recollection, very immediately after I became foreign minister. It was sort of there in the background, but it started to become more and more as we worked our way through further into 2002. And then, as I describe in the book, about going down to the United Nations in the fall of that year and hearing Mr. Bush make his speech calling on Iraq to disarm or else at the United Nations, it became very clear that the Americans were moving stronger in that direction, yeah.
Question two, what happened when the American military was preparing to invade Iraq, and it was becoming, I guess, increasingly clear that the Canadian government had grave misgivings about the whole thing?
Well, the Americans were preparing, and of course they were then putting pressures on their allies to say, well, what are you going to do? We were in the position at that time in the early days of not knowing whether we would participate or not, because our position was that if Saddam Hussein was armed with weapons of mass destruction, and if he represented a real threat to the world community, we would be a participant in dealing with them, provided the appropriate United Nations sanction was given through the Security Council. So we were prepared as Canadians and in the Canadian government to participate in dealing with Saddam Hussein as a potential danger to the world community if we had to. So we couldn't say to the Americans, well, this is crazy, you know, we won't have anything to do with it. So we had discussions with them and said, well, yes, and under the right circumstances, we would participate. But Mr. Chrétien early on made it clear to Mr. Bush in his speech in Chicago. He said, listen, we're only going to do it if it's done under a United Nations mandate and if it's properly done. And also, as I say in the book, if we understand that there is a real threat there, and then, as you know, it's a question of Hans Blix and the others going in and seeing what was the nature of the threat. So there's all sorts of moving parts here going on. But at the beginning, we had to be in a position to either go if it was appropriate, or not go if it was not appropriate. So that's where we were. So we were kind of trying to work both sides of the fence, if you like, but for obviously and logical reasons.
Question three, what ultimately led Jean Chrétien to saying no?
Well, I think a whole host of factors. I would say, firstly, there was no proof that there were weapons of mass destruction. So you couldn't have said that Saddam Hussein represented a threat to the world community. Secondly, there was no Security Council mandate. We'd made it very clear that if we were going to go, we wanted it to be appropriately approved by the United Nations, because if you go in circumstances where it's not, then you're creating international instability. And one of the Canada's thing it's always done is built the international institutions. We built the UN, and when I went there and spoke in the fall, I said, you know, if this is done, it's got to be done in a way that enforces the way in which international institution works, not destroys them. And we could see this destroying the United Nations and destroying the international community if it's done the wrong way. So that was the second reason. The third reason, of course, the public opinion of Canada, partly for both of those other reasons, were strongly opposed to it. And while, you know, some people who were in favor of going would say, well, what's the matter with you? Why don't you show leadership? I'd say, I don't think in a democracy it's leadership to drag your country into a war when people don't believe it's the right thing to do. And it wasn't the right thing to do. Now, there were people at the time who believed that it was. There were strong voices in the Defense Department, certain parts of the business community, and other parts of the community
Conservative Party of Canada.
who were, pardon?
Conservative Party of Canada.
The Conservative Party of Canada, in the House of Commons, there were strong voices saying, you know, we should be there with our American colleagues, regardless, right or wrong. We should be there. We can't afford not to go. It's got nothing to do with the merits of the thing. We've got to be shoulder to shoulder with our American colleagues. So, but all of these factors, I think, when Mr. Chrétien weighed them all up, he looked at the global situation, he looked at the local situation, and he came to the conclusion it was the wrong thing to do. And that's when he made a statement in the House of Commons that he'd come to that conclusion when it became very clear that the Americans were going to go, because they'd said, okay, we're leaving now, we're on our way. So are you with us or you aren't with us? At that point, we had to say whether we were or weren't. We couldn't sit on the fence any longer.
Question 4. His statement in the House of Commons and his ultimate decision not to go, what role do you think you played in those two things?
Well, I'd like to feel that on the lead up to his statement, he'd consulted with me. I totally supported with him. I myself kept in contact with my foreign minister colleagues. So while he would be talking to Mr. Fox or the head of Chile or various other heads of state, I'd be talking to Mr. de Villepin, to Joschka Fischer, who I spoke to a great deal.
The French and German foreign ministers.
Yes, to Colin Powell, even to Igor Ivanov, the Russian foreign minister, who I had lengthy conversations about this with. So my job as the foreign minister was to talk to other foreign ministers, understand what was going on at the UN, to try and create an environment where we could, if possible, either prevent the Americans from going on their own, or at least ensure that if they went, that they had the appropriate imprimatur of the Security Council. And so that was my job. I worked on that. I worked regularly with Mr. Chrétien. We would often phone. I talk in the book about he called me one night. I was at a reception. We had a long conversation, and then the morning he made his statement in the House, he called me. I was working out at the gym, and he called me and he said, I'm going to make a statement. And I went downstairs and drafted some things for him to look at and then sent them over. Eddie Goldenberg worked on it, and he worked on it, and in the end he made the statement he did in the House.
So some of your words made it into his statement?
I think I've got my original draft. I can see some of my words there, yeah.
Okay. Question 5. I think the public is always wondering, if I demonstrate in the streets about an issue I care about, do political decision makers take that into account? And I wonder whether that was the case on Iraq.
Oh, I think any manifestation of public agreement or disagreement of things is taken into account by politicians. It'd be crazy. You'd think I was an idiot if I said no. No, you don't. But sometimes it's persuasive and sometimes it's not. That depends a lot on the situation. But you certainly, I can tell you, Steve, in the lead up to Iraq, I was going across the country, and I was in Halifax, I was in Montreal, I was in Windsor, I was in Victoria, and I would say at the meetings which I was conducting, which were not around Iraq, they were around foreign policy generally, that the feeling of the population was 90%, we shouldn't be doing this.
Question 6. What contribution to the Iraq War did Canada ultimately make?
Well, we do actually make a contribution to reconstruction afterwards, and we made substantial financial contributions to the reconstruction. And we did, if you like, make some contribution in terms of troops themselves, not to the war effort, but we did have our ships in the Gulf, which I describe in the book, which was a tricky business because those ships were there as part of Operation Enduring Freedom, which involved the operations in Afghanistan, not in Iraq itself, but they were patrolling in the Gulf of Hormuz, and so very close to the operations in Iraq. And there was a question as to whether or not by our presence there we would be belligerents. But as I pointed out to people who were critical for us being there, I said, well, the French were very against this mission. They've got a ship in there as well, because we'd committed to that operation, and I don't think you pull out of operations you've committed to because of that. But it added complexities to our position. And in fact, Steve, there were certain troop individual soldiers that had been committed to American or British units, which we left in place because we felt that we couldn't afford to breach the relationship that we had with our most important allies by pulling them out at a point when it would create a real problem for those allies.
Question 7. Canada tried to remain on good terms with the United States despite rejecting the U.S.'s pleas to come into the war. One day, you tell us in the book, Andrew Card, who was the president's chief of staff at the time, demanded that Prime Minister Chrétien say something nice about President George W. Bush in public. Would you tell that story for us?
Well, Precisely as I tell it in the book.
Precisely as you tell it in the book.
Well, so I won't demonstrate it, but no, because my chief of staff said to me, he said, "Well, did you tell the prime minister what the ambassador said?" And so he said, I said, "Yes, I did." And so I said, "What was his?" So he said, "What was his reaction?" So as I tell it in the book, I'd kind of forgotten it, but my chief of staff reminded me. He said, "You said at that time that it looked as if you'd reached underneath the table, grabbed something rather private of his, and twisted it until he made a grimace." So he was it made it clear that he was not happy with the suggestion. Let's put it that way.
You were a little blunter in the book in the way you described it.
Well,
I
TV has its limits.
Okay. Question 8. With more than 10 years of hindsight now, do you think Canada's relationship with the United States has suffered because we took a pass on that war?
No. It took an immediate hit, as I describe in the book, with the withdrawal from the Five Eyes relationship, which is a very important security relationship involving types of information sharing. But even that stopped after about 5 or 6 months. Shortly after, we were in Haiti together. I was working with Colin Powell closely on the Haiti mission, which I describe in the book. We were then, shortly after, deeply involved in Afghanistan and the planning for Afghanistan. And in fact, I think Mr. Rumsfeld at one point said to my colleague, John McCallum, "We'd rather have your troops in Afghanistan than in Iraq anyway, because it enables us to move things around." So in the fullness of time, some of the friction and animosity worked out. But it worked out partly because we were very careful not to get a bugle and blow it in the ear of the Americans about what we were doing. I mean,
Mostly.
No, some people chose not to, but officially, I mean, myself as foreign minister, I was always respectful of Mr. Powell. I was respectful of him anyway because I liked him, and we all respected him as an individual. And President Bush as well was somebody you respected for his title and his position. So you might disagree with them, but you were able to work with them. I think that. Generally, business people, as I say in the book, really, when you look at the United States and Canada, it's such a complicated matrix of relationships, universities, homes, families, businesses. Everybody's tied up with one another, so that when something like this happens, it causes a tremor, but it doesn't cause an earthquake or a shatter. Whereas with the French, for example, they came at it so hard that it really upset the Americans, and it really did interfere with their relationship. And the Germans, for example, became a big issue in the German election. So that became a different discourse for them than with the Americans than with ourselves.
Question 9. I didn't know any of this, but your son Patrick, journalist, was in Iraq at the time of the Iraq War. You're the foreign minister of Canada. The war is on. Did that ever get awkward for you?
Well, it was a big concern to Kathy and myself in terms of his physical safety, that's for sure. Because in fact, in one day, the day that the first day they dropped their bombs, I said to him, "Where on earth are you?" And he said, "I'm hiding in a toilet over by the Tigris River," sort of thing. And so I said, "Great." So he said, "Well, this is supposed to be quite a safe place. Actually, I'm with one of my handlers. They feel it's safe over here." He was counting on this Iraqi officer to help look after him. And then another time he was in the hotel where a lot of the journalists were, and an American tank fired a shell into a floor, and it killed the journalist in a room right below his own room. So it was a dangerous place to be. But he's done a lot of those missions. He's been in done a lot of war journalism, if you want to call it that. And he's very shrewd about the way he makes friends and is able to maneuver around. But
where is he now?
We're worried. Well, he's in Toronto now. He's married and has a child, and so I think he's maybe on a somewhat shorter leash than he was when he would go off to Libya or one of the zones. But it was an awkward time, and he phoned me on my birthday, which was March 17th, the day that Mr. Chrétien made his statement in the House, and he said, "Dad, happy birthday." I said, "What's going on there?" And I said, "Well, it's pretty busy here with all this." we both laughed and thought, well, our conversation at least will be recorded by somebody on both sides as we were talking to one another.
Question 10, finally. There is a notion out there, I think it's fair to say, that Canada became very heavily involved in Afghanistan as a kind of a, okay, America, we weren't there for you in Iraq, and therefore we'll do a make good for you in Afghanistan.
Right.
True or false?
I would say it's false, but I you know, being both a lawyer and a politician, so I'll have some caveats to that. I don't accept that we went to Afghanistan in order to pay the Americans for not going to Iraq. It was not that. If we shouldn't have gone to Afghanistan, we shouldn't go to Afghanistan. It'd be for different. We went to Afghanistan because of the Bonn Accords, because of the United Nations Security Council resolution, because we were part of NATO and we agreed that we had to reconstruct Afghanistan. That was the principal reason. Did it have a positive effect on our relationship with the United States? Yes. So the United States relationship informed to some extent our decision to go there. It was helpful in us making that decision, Steve, but every foreign policy decision made by Canada is to some extent informed by what is going on in Washington. This country is inextricably related to the United States of America through trade and security matters. But when you come to security, it is the United States that has provided the security for Canada and for Canadians for the last 50 years, 60 years. And we understand that, and we understand that we have a role to play in that, but we understand that we manage that, and that this is a part of our thinking. But it doesn't have to, as we showed with Iraq, it doesn't have to make you do it. And so it doesn't make you do it, but it informs part of how you do about it and how you go about it.
Understood. The Call of the World is Bill Graham's political memoir, and we thank you for sitting here and taking 10 questions on Iraq for us.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.